So we'll start with so we're talking about 7 ways to improve your teaching skills. My first top tip, and for me, this was crucial in helping me develop my teaching skills. The first 2 tips here, I think, are my 2 most important tips that I can give you. And this first one is to write down how-to instructions for image acquisition. So think of it like a dummy's guide to how to get a particular image. When I first started teaching, and I started teaching the doctors, we wanted to give them a book, the How-to Dummy's Guide of Ultrasound. And it covered everything from what does the gain and depth button do to how do you get a picture of the gallbladder, for example. And so the process of actually sitting down and taking pen to paper and writing down a step-by-step instruction for how you're going to get a particular image, I think was really, really helpful for me insofar as figuring out what to say and how to say it, but also just to make sure that I'm covering all the steps. And so it's a nice way to do task deconstruction. And so what I used to do is write down, okay, I'm going for the gallbladder, for example. I'm going to start in the midline with the probe in the longitudinal position, probe marker to the head. And then we're going to move the probe towards the patient's right, or sweep the probe. And then we'll rock the probe or heel toe the probe, and then do an adjustment of or rotate to get the angle. And so I step it out and go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, all the way to however many steps that it takes to get the image. Now, doing that means that not only do I figure out a consistent way of putting those instructions into words for my learner, but it also makes sure that as I'm instructing, that I have a consistent way of teaching my students how to get the image, but also how to, what are those crucial steps? I practice this on my husband. He's been my crash test dummy a number of times, but he's not a sonographer. So I get him to follow my instructions to the letter, and then I discover, well, which steps was I leaving out? And so oftentimes, if you find out you're leaving out a step, that might be the reason why your student is not quite getting it, because there's a crucial step in the process that you've missed. And so it's a nice way of figuring out how to do that task deconstruction and to break it down into smaller pieces for your students. And typically, you're aiming to get a sequence of steps that's less than 7 steps in one process. If you've got something that's a 14-step process, you should break that down into 2 separate bits. And that's because our brain remembers, George Miller did a study, and our brain remembers 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at a time. And so if you think of your telephone numbers, the old telephone numbers for the landline, they were 7 numbers. Then as we ran out of numbers, we went to 8 numbers long. And the reason that they're not anything more than that is because our brain struggles to remember lots of things all at once. And so that study sort of said about proving that our brain can consistently remember 7 plus or minus 2 steps. Now, there are other studies that were talking about 5 plus or minus 2. But obviously, the longer the list of steps that you have in it, the harder it is to remember all that information for yourself, but also for your learner, who is trying to process a lot of information all at one time. And so if you can break down that instruction list into 7 plus or minus 2 steps, and if it's more than that, break it down again, and you do it as a part 1 and a part 2, if you like. But we start with, where do we put the probe? What landmarks? What are the key landmarks that we're looking for? What probe move do you do next? And how do you isolate those probe movements? And what's the language that you're going to use to describe those movements? It's really helpful if you've talked through with your learner what language you're specifically going to use. Now, we use the term rock the probe. Some use the term heel toe the probe. But if you're all on the same page with what the words are and how you're going to describe your probe moves, then your learner's not translating those instructions every time you open your mouth. So if you can figure out how to write down those steps for how to get that image step by step, including isolating each and every move, then you've got a clearer way to describe this process to your student. My second top tip was to stand on the other side of the bed. And there's a number of reasons for this. So I found that if I stood on the same side of the bed as the sonographer, the temptation to play with the machine and just adjust the gain ever so slightly, or to just put my hand on my student's hand and get the image for them because I was frustrated that they couldn't get it, the temptation is really strong. And the problem with that is that then your learner is not actually learning it. As soon as you put your hand on your learner's hand, you're doing it. And unless you give them explicit instruction around, I want you to feel what I'm doing, or unless you draw their attention to, can you feel me doing this movement, so that they tune into what's happening with their hand, they just kind of switch off, and then you've managed to get the view, and that's great, but you already knew how to do it, and the learner hasn't really achieved anything. And so the reasons for standing on the other side of the bed is that it takes that temptation away. And it also forces me to put into words what my learner needs to do. If I have to be telling them, I need you to adjust the depth, then they're tuning into that. Where should the depth be? And you can quiz that, where do we need to set the depth? The depth is set too deep. Where's the optimal depth setting? So if they have to actively engage with changing that setting, whatever setting it might be, then they're learning more from that than if you're just doing it for them. And so standing on the other side of the bed for me took that temptation away, because I don't know how many of you are radiographers, but remember the tutors who would just adjust it by 1 kV every time, and it'd drive you nuts. But not only does it take the temptation away, but it also forces me to put into words what it is that I need to do. And if I have to repeat it again and again, then they've got that auditory cue as well that they need to practice, and they can remember. You're tuning into the auditory channels as well, that those instructions, then, okay, I've got to put my probe just in the middle, and then I'm going to do step 1, step 2, step 3. And if they hear that repeated again and again, when you're not there to chirp on their shoulder, they've got a better chance of remembering that consistent way that you've written down in our previous step, that consistent way that you've written down the instructions, so that, that plan A is there for them to go back and practice again and again. Now, every now and then, I do put my hand on the probe. And I hate doing it most of the time because it forces me into a really poor ergonomic position. But I also feel quite uncomfortable getting in right behind my learner's back and invading their personal space. And never has that been more important than in COVID times. So, standing on the other side of the bed is not only about social distancing, but it's also just about, maintaining everyone's personal space. So if my learner is really struggling to get that view, and it doesn't matter how I describe it, they can't seem to understand how big or how small the movement is, what I do then is I draw their attention to the facts. So first I ask their permission. I use their name to grab their attention. Hey, Sally, I'm just going to come in behind you now and put my hand on the probe. I want you to feel what I'm doing. Is that okay? And then I position myself, and that whole process has kind of cued them in to pay attention to your right hand. Now, before I just get the view, I ask them to watch my hand while I've got the probe on their hand so that they can see how big those probe movements are. And when they're looking at their hand, I'm asking them, I want you to feel the difference here. Feel this. This is what you were doing. This is how much I need you to move it. So I'm getting them to tune into what it feels like, because otherwise they're just looking at the screen mesmerized. And if I haven't gone through that process, often I find that my learner will I put my hand on theirs and I just feel them disengage, and then they're sitting there with a limp wrist and not doing anything. There's someone with their audio on. If you could mute your screen, that'd be great. So when I get them to tune in to what their hand is doing, I show them that probe movement. And then we repeat it, I describe it and we repeat it. And then I pick their hand up and my hand up, and then I ask them to do it again. And the reason I ask them to do it again is so that they've got a chance to practice and feel it and do it for themselves and experience the success for themselves. If I come in and I just get the image for them and we move on because we're in a hurry, again, they haven't learned anything. I've got the image and they haven't. So I think it's really important that if you are going to put your hand on their hand to scan, that there are other cues around feel what I'm doing, and you're doing it for a specific purpose. It's not the fallback point for, all the time, I'm just going to scan with my hand on your hand, because what are they actually learning if you're getting the pictures? And as I said, there are some times when, it doesn't matter how you describe it, how good your instructions are, they're not tuning in or whatever, they just don't get it. And so every now and then it is necessary. But as a way of looking after your own back, because that position when you're standing in behind them can get very, very uncomfortable, as a way of looking after yourself, but also so that it's actually for a purpose when you're putting your hand on their hand, and make sure they're tuning into that purpose.
I was going to say, Suean, it's Alan here. Hi, thanks.
Hi.
One other, I'm sure I touched the machine and the patient and the learner's hand and the probe too much, but there's one time when I find it really valuable is to show them how hard to press.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they think they're pressing hard, and we all did it when we first pick up the probe, and I need to teach them to press 3 times harder than they think they're pressing when they're pressing hard. And I can't seem to get the idea. I know it's about they don't want to cause the patient discomfort. I think that's the main issue, is they think they're going to cause the patient discomfort. But it is a little bit like pulling hairs, isn't it? You sort of got to sometimes do it quick because it's faster. You get your answer faster. But I find that's probably the number one time I get benefit from putting my hand on the patient, on their learner's hand, is because I can't get them to understand how hard to press, and then they're shocked, and the patient's a bit shocked as well when I press.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing with that is not just to go in and push. Some of them will cue in, but I actually cue them. I want you to feel how hard I'm pushing. Or if I've gone in and the first thing I've done is push, then I go back to where they're at and I say, and then I'll repeat it. Feel the difference here, and I cue them into what's the difference, so that they can physically tune into that difference. Because otherwise, again, you've just done the picture and you've done all the hard work, and what have they learned? So I agree with you. Every now and then it's necessary for the fact that, they don't get how hard to push, or the other places in obstetrics, they really don't understand how fine a tweak it is, and they're either over-rotating or they're not isolating the probe movement, and they're doing a couple of things together that they just can't remember the order. So when I do put my hand on theirs, I am cueing them into what I'm doing. And if I'm standing on the other side of the bed, it removes the temptation and it forces me to do the coaching rather than just, hey, I can do this, let me show you. My tip number 3.
Especially if you're short.
What was that?
Especially when you're short with short arms and short legs.
It's a problem. Now, tip number 3 is to get inside your learner's mind. It's really important to understand where your learner's at. What is it that they want to know, or do they need to know? And so I'll start a session with, what is it you need from me? What's the one thing you want to nail in this prac session? Or what is it that you're struggling with the most? How can I help you best? Because if I can solve that problem, and if they're switched on enough to have understood that, hey, this is where I'm struggling, that helps. But I also want to just explore where they're at for other reasons as well. And one of the most common mistakes we made is to assume that someone's told them XYZ. And particularly for the student that has 3 or 4 different tutors, they're with a different tutor each day of the week, or a different tutor every time they scan, maybe even different tutors on the same day. And everyone has assumed that someone else has taught them this, or everyone else has assumed that they know this particular aspect. So I'm trying to get inside their head and figure out where are they now and what do they need from me? Because if I can make it relevant for them, and if I can solve that problem, it means it's more likely to stick. And the other reason I want to know where are they at now is because what foundation am I building on? What information do they have so that I don't repeat that and I don't waste time going over that again? But what information do they have right now? And what's the next little step that's going to extend them a little bit, but not challenge them so much so that they just give up, hands in the air, and give up altogether? So where are they at now and where do they need to be helps me form a plan as well for how we're going to get there. So as I said, some of the questions: what are you having trouble with? Where are you getting stuck? Where are you at right now? What can you do? What do you need to do? So that we can figure out how to serve them best, for want of a better word, how to serve them best in that next teaching moment. Tip number 4 is to improve your presentation skills. Now, it seems quite obvious, but at some point, every educator is going to need to give a presentation to someone. And if you can think about your presentation skills as a skill in and of itself, that you focus on improving that skill, then that means that when you're giving a presentation, if you've got a good presentation and you've done a good job of putting it together, then your presentation is more likely to stick. And not only is your time then well spent preparing this, but also your learner can get the maximum benefit out of the fact that they've sat there and listened to you for half an hour, however long it is. Now, I'd recommend, if any of you are interested, there's a paediatric surgeon from Sheffield in England, Dr. Ross Fisher, and his website is F for Fred Folliet, FOLLIET, I think it is, .com, so FOLLIET.com. He has done, he's got a website that's called P Cubed, and he talks about presentations as being 3 separate but interrelated components. So he talks about sorting out what is your message, looking at your media or your slide deck, and then how do you deliver your presentation. And so if you focus on those 3 separate components of your presentation and pull them together successfully, then your presentation has a better chance of sticking and being beneficial, not only for you as a teacher, having been effective in your teaching, but also for your learner. And so we look at the message. What is the message we're trying to convey? Is this just about imparting information, or is it about trying to win them over to your point of view? Or, do we need to persuade them to change their practice in some way? So we're trying to figure out what is your topic, and then the why, or the so what of your topic. So yes, we're going to talk about gallbladder today, but so what? Why is it important to your learner? And if you can get to the bottom of that, get inside your learner's head, figure out what it is that they need, what it is that they know now, and what is it that they want to know or need to know, and what's the pathway that's going to get us there the most effectively. Now, the second part, or the P2 that Ross talks about, is the media, which is your slide deck. I'm sure all of you have been to many presentations where there's heaps and heaps of words up on the screen, and they're reading it, or there's lots of words, and you're now in the audience trying to choose between, am I reading this slide or am I listening to what they're saying? So when you design your presentations, it should be around having a slide deck that supports your delivery rather than is your presentation. It's you as the presenter that brings the value to that presentation. And so, when you're conveying statistics, have you just cut and pasted something out of a journal article with some graph that, if you're at the back of the auditorium, you can't even read it, much less make sense of it? Or if you're in the audience, are you more interested in, well, what did that presenter extrapolate out of the graph? So, is it 50% of African Americans have heart disease, for example. How can you convey that information differently without writing a big graph up there, a whole heap of statistics that don't mean a whole lot to a lot of people in the audience? So how do you design your slides so that they actually support your message rather than detract from your message? And the third component of the presentation, or of your presentation skills, is how you deliver your presentation. And that's about, you know, how you introduce yourself, how you establish your credibility, how you deal with question time, how you overcome your fear of public speaking or whatever it might be. How do you wrap up? How do you keep in control of question time so that it's not derailed by a weird question that's a little slightly off topic? So what are the things that you need to do as a presenter to bring that presentation together so that you effectively communicate your message to your audience so that there is value in that presentation? And I know for myself, I've done a number of different presentation courses where, and it's a process. You start with lots of words on the slide, but with effort and focus on enhancing your presentations, you can make a much more successful presentation. And it's interesting, I've recently done some sonographer teaching, and there was a couple of slides in there that I was struggling with. We're in a bit of a hurry, so I left them with words on it. And so I might have a slide deck that's, I don't know, 35 or 40 slides. And I had, in this one presentation that I can remember, I had 2 slides on there that had more than my 6 words as the rule of thumb that I kind of use. I try to keep it as less than 6 words on a slide. And so these 2 slides, as soon as I put words up on my screen, my students immediately started taking notes. And they were writing down, and then I don't know how much they heard, but they just started copying exactly what was up on the screen. And some of that's about habit, but it's interesting because for all the other slides where we didn't have lots of words on the screen, they still took home the take-home points. And that's in how you design your presentation so that you get your message across. My 5th tip is to watch others teach. And I don't mean just sort of be in the room with them. I mean, actively observe how they're teaching and what they're doing. What are they doing and why are they doing that? So you need to be, I mean, don't go out there and be critical and give them all your feedback or whatever, but it's in your own mind. Really observe and be actively engaged in the why and the how and what techniques they're using as they're teaching. And why are they using that particular technique? And if you don't know, ask them. You can be watching others teach, and sometimes it's as simple as someone says something in a different way and it works. It just resonates with the student better. I personally had that situation well before I was doing ultrasound. I used to be a gymnastics coach, and I had one of my gymnasts was known for having sloppy footwork, and I was constantly nagging her to point her toes. And I would harp and really nag her to point her toes. And we had a guest coach come in one day, and she was there for an hour, and she said to my student, stretch your feet. And all of a sudden, my student is pointing her toes. And it was just in saying it in a slightly different way that actually worked. From that moment on, anytime I wanted her to point her toes, I would say, stretch your feet, because it worked. And sometimes when you hear someone else describe something, they can have a cleaner way of saying it or a different way of looking at it that will resonate with your learners better. And so what are the things that they're saying? How can you say things differently? If you observe others teach and you see something that's going well, how do you incorporate that aspect into your teaching? How do you, what strategies is that other tutor using to keep the learner engaged? What is it about their teaching that you like, and what is it that you dislike? Now, you don't need to tell them, hey, I didn't like this or I did like that. You don't need to tell them. It's just sort of sitting back and critically observing them. And if you're really, really brave, put a video on and video yourself, because we're our own worst sort of coach and our own harshest critic. And so you can video yourself and then go back and look at it and think, well, how could I have done that differently? Or when you watch yourself teach, you can see things that you can be completely unconscious of until it's actually there in front of you. So, I mean, that's brave and it's hard to do. I'm not going to lie about it. We did it for a university assignment and I hated every minute of it. But, geez, there was some learning to be had. Now, tip number 6 is to have a plan. Now, a lot of our teaching happens in an ad hoc kind of a way, but typically there are some topics that come up again and again. And so if you can develop a plan that's consistent for those common topics and have something on paper that sort of sets out, well, here's the learning objective and here's how, this is where they're starting, this is where I need them to finish up, and here's how we're going to get there. We're going to start with step 1, and that's what I'm going to focus on first. And when they can do step 1 successfully, we're going to move on to step 2, etc. The thing with this is that a common problem that we have with our learners is that we overload them. We're trying to achieve too much in too little time. Now, it depends if you've got a 5-minute teaching moment or whether you're with that student for a day, or whether you're with that student for 12 months, but you can't put 12 months of teaching into a day. So, depending on, how long you are with that student, you need to set some goals around what are we trying to achieve. And if you set some goals, whether it be writing it down or even just state that to your learner, this is what we're trying to get across today, or this is what we need to achieve today, then you start to have clarity about how you're going to get there. And so, for example, we might do a prac session for 75 minutes or 90 minutes or so. And so in that prac session, we're concentrating on 1 or 2 things, practically speaking. So if I have a bunch of novices doing a gallbladder scan, the very first scan that we're doing, or the first session, all I'm trying to get across is have them explore the window and to achieve a good window to find the gallbladder. Now, they can't go ahead and optimize the image and start documenting and reporting on it if they can't even find it to start with. So our first step is finding the gallbladder. And once they can find the gallbladder, then I want to get them working through those different probe moves and isolating the probe moves and understanding action and consequence of those probe moves so that they can improve their view of the anatomy. So they might find a gallbladder, but now we're concentrating on, I want to get that gallbladder in longitudinal, or I want to get that gallbladder in transverse. And you can't do that unless you've first found a good window and you've got the positioning right. So once we've found a good window, the next thing we move on to is, all right, now you've got an image and you can actually scan and we can get a picture. I want you to optimize your image here so that we've got the frequency, depth, focus, gain all set correctly. And then we move on to, all right, now let's do that survey scan and let's scan through the gallbladder and assess it for pathology. Now they have to do all of that before they can even think about the series of pictures that they're going to take so that they can demonstrate that pathology or that normal gallbladder to the radiologist or to whoever they need to communicate it to. So if you've got a plan for what steps you're going to take and they have to achieve step 1 first before they move on to step 2, that also helps to add clarity to your teaching, but also starts to make that learning pathway more efficient for your learner as well. And let's face it, one of the things that we're all desperately short on when we're teaching is time. So the more that we can do to make the teaching efficient, the better it is for not only ourselves as the tutor, but also for our students. Now, tip number 7 is to get some feedback on your teaching. And there's a few different ways to do this. I mentioned already before that you could set up a video and film yourself. And that's big and brave and scary, and there's no getting around that. It is big and brave and scary. But it's amazing what you can learn when you're watching yourself. If it's a presentation that you're giving, I mean, all of us hate listening to yourselves. I don't know, I certainly do. But when you're listening to yourself speaking, whether it just be you've put your phone in your pocket and recorded yourself, or put it on the bench and recorded yourself, or whether you videoed yourself, you'll all of a sudden be conscious of your verbal tics and how many times you say I was watching my daughter's history class the other day, and her teacher, I think every fifth or sixth word said and it became so interrupting of what she was trying to get across that that's all I could hear was Sometimes you're not aware of your verbal tics. It might not be One that I've heard that drove me nuts was, do you see what I mean? Do you see what I mean? And now that if you're in the audience and you don't get it, then you feel dumb. But if you're in the audience and you hear, do you see what I mean, every 3 or 4 sentences, then it becomes distracting from the message. So either you haven't put it together right in the first place, if they're not seeing what you mean, or you're completely unconscious of this verbal tic that you have. So recording yourself or watching yourself, it's a big, brave move, but we are, as I said, often our own harshest critics. Now, the other way that you can get feedback is that you can ask. You can ask your colleagues. You can ask the student. If you are going to ask, I do recommend that you be very specific about what you're asking for. Now, I've asked my team here before and said, hey, can you give me some feedback on my presentation? And I come out and they go, oh, no, that was great. That was great. I'm like, yeah, but what am I doing? Is there anything that you would change? No. Oh, no, that was all right. And I found that I have to ask a question. Here's where I think I'm messing up, or this is what I'm doing. Can you watch out for this particular thing for me? For example, are there any verbal tics as I'm giving a presentation? Can you watch my presentation here? And are there any verbal tics that you notice? You've asked for it quite explicitly, and then they can concentrate on that, and the chances are is then the feedback will be quite constructive. And feedback like that can come from the strangest of places. I remember rehearsing for a presentation that I was giving at a GP conference, I think it was, and I was just going through my presentation and sorting out, getting rid of all the creases and you know, figuring out how to explain that point better. And so I was just verbally going through that presentation, and one of my kids was there, and I think my daughter at the time was about 11 or 12, and she mightn't have even been that much, but anyway, she said, oh, can I watch you, Mum? And I'm like, yeah, sure, can I? Fair enough. And she said, so I started, and she said, no, too many start again. So I come back again, and I wasn't actually rehearsing it for that as much as anything, but I went with it. And then she positioned, because we were away, she positioned all our suitcases around the room, and she's like, no, you're not making eye contact over here. So if you be specific, she had no idea what the topic was, had no clue about what any of the content was that I was talking about. So all she could focus on was how was I delivering it. And so ironically, it provided some really interesting feedback because, and she wasn't scared to say, kids aren't, but she could provide some really interesting feedback that I couldn't get from other people because they either felt intimidated, didn't want to say, or I hadn't asked for it in the right way. So if you're asking colleagues or if you're asking students for feedback, ask specific questions. What is it that you are specifically wanting some feedback on? And another way that you can get some feedback, and this one for me, I found is a great way to figure out whether my teaching has been effective. If I have got a lesson plan that says, in this topic, we are wanting to cover goal 1, goal 2, and goal 3. And this is how we're going to get there, and I give a presentation. I'll then ask my learners at the end of that, what were your 3 take-home points? Now, sometimes it surprises you what message they're taking home from what you've said. But I want to get some correlation between my stated goals for the presentation and what they're actually taking home from the presentation. And so by asking those questions in a roundabout way, I get feedback on the effectiveness of my teaching. So that's a really favourite one of mine, is to ask my learners for what are your top 3 take-home points from today. Now, I did say 7, but I'm going to give you a bonus tip here. And my last tip here is to be curious. The more curious you can be and the more motivated you can be to improve your teaching skills, the chances are those teaching skills will improve. I remember going to a conference one time, and in the Virgin magazine, Richard Branson said, hire for skill, not for attitude. No, hire for attitude, not for skill. Hire for attitude, not for skill. So you might not necessarily have the skill, but if you've got the right attitude, you can learn that skill. And so if you're curious about teaching methods, if you're curious about how you can improve your teaching, then you'll do the extra work that will help you to improve your teaching. Be curious and ask if you've got a student who's come in and you're really struggling with how to get a point across or how to deal with a particular problem, ask other tutors. There may be others who have dealt with that exact same problem. And it's amazing when you're talking to other tutors, what sort of things can flush out in that conversation and different ways of dealing with it that then you can go home and practice. Look at what methods have been used in other medical fields or other skills teaching scenarios. For example, there's a lot of psychomotor skills stuff and literature written in gymnastics literature, which is handy for me because I used to be a gymnastics coach. But I think the ability to be able to break a skill down for gymnastics, like you don't just start being Simone Biles and end up doing a triple back twisting somersault on the floor without first having done a backward roll and getting your spatial awareness happening on the ground. And so the breaking it down aspect of teaching, there are other things, other sports, other fields of medicine that have done stuff. What can you learn from those other fields? How can you apply a solution that has worked successfully in nursing skills teaching, for example? How does that translate if you were teaching an ultrasound skill? What can we learn from air traffic controllers? Now, air traffic controllers have amazing spatial perception. What skills development do they do to hone those skills, and how can we use that, and how does that translate into an ultrasound context? And for me, my biggest curiosity, and I haven't solved this problem yet, my biggest curiosity is, how do you teach spatial perception? And I've Googled these things. How do you, in what other fields are they teaching spatial perception? What things do they do to develop it? How do you get better at describing spatial perception to someone? We'll use spatial words. So it doesn't have to be just ultrasounds that we can learn from. And unfortunately, in the ultrasound context, there's a real lack of literature specifically written for ultrasound teaching. And so we do need to look to other fields. Be curious about that. What can we learn from places unexpected that might contribute to our teaching skills? And it's a constant fine-tuning process. Go get an idea, play with it, go and try it out. Did it work? Didn't it work? Tweak it a bit, try again. Be curious about your teaching skills. That will help you to develop your teaching skills. So we have covered 7 tips and a bonus. Those 7 tips, the first one was write how-to instructions. It's like the dummy's guide to getting the gallbladder view, or the dummy's guide to the parasternal long axis view of the heart. Where do you put your probe? What are the series of isolated probe movements that you do to get to where you need it to be that works for most people? And this isn't a one solution fits all. I always talk about having plan A that works for 80%, plan B for another 10%, plan C for another 5%, and maybe there's 5% of people that we're just not going to get a good image on. But we need to be able to have a good written description of plan A so that we can articulate that very clearly to our students and help them learn more efficiently. Tip 2 was to stand on the other side of the bed, which removes the temptation from hand on the probe and forces you to articulate and describe what you want your learner to do. They then get that constant auditory cue so that they can take that with them. I remember a course that I did in the States. The tutor kept talking about how to find the window for the parasternal long axis view. She keeps talking about walk the walk. And I've got her very New York accent in my ear. And every time I go to get that view, I'm like, walk the walk. And so I remember that, and I walk the walk when I get my pictures. Get inside your learner's mind. Where are they at? Where do they need to be, or where do they want to be? And how do you get there the most efficiently? Concentrate on improving your presentation skills. And as I said, it's a multi-pronged attack here. What is your message? Get really clear on your message. Develop a slide deck that supports your message and doesn't detract from your message. And then practice how you deliver so that you can improve each one of those aspects of your presentation, and then it will stick with your learner more. Tip 5 is to watch others teach. How are they saying things? What did you like? What didn't you like? How would you do it better? What worked in that teaching session? How did they keep the others engaged if it's just one-on-one? What was working? What didn't work? Be curious about how they're doing stuff and why they're doing things. Tip 6 is to have a plan. What's your goal and how are you going to achieve it? And tip 7 is to get feedback from your learners, from colleagues. Get feedback from yourself. Be brave, watch yourself. It's uncomfortable, but it's effective. So they're the 7 tips that I've got that you can try to work at and in improving your teaching skills. And I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out here. We're holding our first Australian version of the Train the Ultrasound Trainer course. It's a 2-day course focused on developing your teaching skills. Yes, there's ultrasound machines in the building, but no, we're not really using them. So we're talking about how to improve your teaching skills and what are the different aspects of teaching that you can work on to improve your skills as a teacher rather than as a sonographer. And so that's coming up next May, on the 7th and 8th of May. And if you're interested in that, feel free to get in touch with me. My email is here, my Twitter handle, either at Zedu Now or IC Sound, or email the old-fashioned way. But you can go to our website at ultrasoundtraining.com.au, and you can register there. So I'm going to just chuck it out to you guys now and see, are there any tips that you have had that you have found to be really effective when you're teaching? Are there any things that you've done that have worked for you that you'd like to share with the group? Don't be shy.
Hi, Suean.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Well, thank you. Little thing, instead of sticking your arm across the screen to try to point out the anatomy, one of the little things is sometimes a laser pointer or something similar to, so you can still be on the other side of the bed, but indicating what you're trying to show on the screen.
Yeah, I've found the laser pointers don't necessarily reflect off the bright green ones do, but they're hard to come by, and they don't. Something about the TV monitors absorbs the screen, and so I've got like one of these telescopic laser pointers, telescopic pointers, and I can stand on the other side of the bed and reach, and I can show them where the buttons are on the machine. I can point to it, or I can point to the anatomy on the monitor. It's just important to make sure they got a nice soft tip, but the telescopic pointers are really handy for exactly that. And perfect. I agree, these I think I just got on Amazon or Gumtree or whatever, and I think they're about $10–15 each. But I love it.
And you can get them on the knuckles with it.
I was going to say, absolutely. Yeah, you can hit them on the knuckles.
Absolutely. Are there any other tips that anyone has for teaching that they've found has been helpful for them or that they've observed?
I think it depends on the level of your learner. Like, obviously, I think it's a good saying that as a learner, that nothing makes you learn better than trying to teach it to someone else. But probably opens a big can of worms, because this is more focused on you as the teacher. But I remember that course that we did, you were referring to, and they kept on saying assessment drives learning, assessment drives learning. And I've truly found that if there's no assessment involved, it's often hard to engage your learners, because they don't see the value in it necessarily straight away, unless it means they're going to pass an exam, or they're going to earn more money, or they're going to get a qualification as a result of it. So I suppose you could spend another hour talking about assessment and how to do it. But what would be your initial thoughts on how best to assess a hands-on skill like POCUS? Let's just say you've given them a few run-throughs on doing an EFAST. Maybe, whether it's a formative, I suppose maybe more the summative. Do you have any thoughts on what's the best form of summative assessment for your typical POCUS type of examination?
I've looked at many different assessment forms, and I find that none of them quite hit the nail on the head. And I think that, and I'm still working on this myself, really, insofar as a lot of us, if you've been teaching for a long time, you know when someone can do it. But to be able to tick a box, what is it that you're specifically looking for, and how to articulate what it is that you're specifically looking for. And so there's a lot of assessment forms that are out there that try to be as objective as possible, or, yes, you've got it, or no, you're not quite there yet. But I don't know that I've seen a really, really good one that I love, and I'd be interested if any others have seen a good one that they love, because I'm keen to look. That quite captures it. And I think for me, when I'm looking and when I'm assessing someone, I'm looking for them to purposefully find it, rather than crazy hands it, or, just happen upon it and, oh, look, there's the gallbladder. I'm looking for them to purposefully find it and do very deliberate probe moves. And so to ask them to articulate to me and describe what it is they're doing is, I found, well, that's what we do here, because it's informal and it's not leading to an exam or whatever. But can you describe the series of moves that you do to get there, or how would you go about doing it? If they can put it into words, I can get an idea of what they're thinking. And as they're, when you're watching that student that's just drifting aimlessly, I've very often started coaching them to get the wrong view, and they'll
would that be more
else.
of a, but that sort of bit, what you're talking about there, probably be more at the formative assessment stage, I would imagine, because you're not supposed to give them too much help or guidance in a summative assessment.
Formative stage, yes, but for a summative assessment, like I said, I don't know that I've seen a really good example. I've seen a lot of attempts made, because those assessment forms are trying to sort of serve two purposes: show the learner what they're doing and where they're either doing well or not doing well. But the behind the scenes motive about this is there has to be enough documentation so that if you failed the learner, you've got something there that's defensible and that's written. And that's where it gets tricky. So they either meet one objective so that you write every single thing down, but I haven't seen a really good example of one that kind of articulates what the elements are that we're looking for when we're trying to assess. Has anyone got some ideas themselves?
They tend to fall into two types of groups of assessment forms, don't they? There's the tick box one to make sure nothing's been forgotten and they've achieved all the required views, and can recognize the pathology, and it's just so you don't forget a major thing and go, oops, I forgot to cover that during the assessment. And then there's the qualitative, so there's the sort of quantitative tick boxy type of one where it's volume and making sure you don't miss anything. And then there's the qualitative type assessment forms, isn't it, where it says at the required standard, above the required standard, clearly above the required standard, or in the opposite direction. But it doesn't say a lot about how you necessarily judge that. It doesn't go into the granular
it doesn't
detail.
define the standard. More often than not, it doesn't tell you here's the standard either. And that's where I find those forms are really challenging. And then looking at it from the other side, when you've had the student who has not passed and then they're writing and they're saying, well, I want to be reconsidered, or what did I do wrong? How do those forms perform in demonstrating why the student hasn't met it? And I think there was one, and I can't remember the wording, but we did cover it in that course, Alan, where it was, there was a category that they used in the med students literature where, you know, yeah, you're either competent or you're clearly not competent, or you just need a little bit of tweaking. And so there's that qualifying bit where I think if they do another 20 cases, they'll get this. And they're close, but not quite. And I can't remember what the exact wording was.
Sometimes a bit blended, but I think probably actually I didn't give a good that I did say 2 click examples, but another example I don't mind so much is the one that tends to say can perform totally independently, can perform with, you know, a small amount of assistance. You know, it sort of grades depending on how much assistance they need or how much oversight they need. And I don't quite mind that, because it puts it into the sort of almost the clinical realm of how much time do you need to spend watching this person. But again, it's still subjective, isn't it? You know,
it is. And that's, like I'm saying, is the subjective nature of it, with a lack of a really clearly defined, well, here's the standard. I haven't found them where it gives you the words, or it gives you the mechanism to describe, well, how is it? Is it an attitude thing? Is it a knowledge thing? Or is it a skills thing? And I think attitude can be a bit airy-fairy. Knowledge is easy to test because you can do your university exams and you can ask them to regurgitate the information. But the skills thing, in ultrasound terms, I don't think I've seen a really good form that articulates it nicely, that says, okay, we know as we're watching them, if you're an experienced user, you know that they've either got it and can do this or it doesn't. But what is it that, and how is it that you know? And I don't think that they're articulated particularly well. Does anyone else have any other comments to add? Otherwise, we might wrap it up. And Anzel was just saying she liked the first idea to instruct and describe how to get the message across more clearly. I think for me, back in the very early days, writing the Dummies Guide 2 was the single best thing I could have done, because it helped me, because I had to go through that process. And if you've ever had to describe a BPD picture, how are you going to get someone else and teach someone else a step-by-step method that is consistent each and every time, regardless of which way the baby's lying, what's happening, where do you start and where do you end up? What are you going to teach them? What's really easy? What's their home-based position? Where do they start? How are they going to move? How do I get that message across consistently each and every time? And certainly for me, writing the Dummies Guide to here's how to do a BPD, or here's how to do the head circumference, helped me to figure out what the heck it was that I was actually doing as I got those pictures. You know, if I've got cerebellum in the picture, what do I need to instruct my student to do to correct that image? And yeah, you can just keep moving it, and we can wait patiently while they kind of discover it. And then they've kind of discovered it and they don't actually know what they've done either. And then it's not reproducible the next time they come back. And so going through that process of breaking it down to a really micro level like that really helped in being able to problem solve what it is that I needed to tell my student in order to help them the best. And so
I was going to say, do you see, I see what happens sometimes is you've actually broke it down, and it's interesting what happens is, let's say you broke it down into a 5 or 6 step process. After a while, sometimes it's like a bad habit that they get into. They jump ahead of the step 1 and step 2 and go straight to step 3 or step 4, and then wonder why they're struggling to get the picture, because they've broken the system down and tried to jump ahead, but the system's not designed to work that way.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we've all stood there frustrated and thinking, God, just move the probe a little bit. And so, and you know, like the next biggest problem you have as a tutor is, can you just push freeze? Like, but recognizing that for the student to know that this picture is as good as I can get on this patient, and I have gone through this step, this step, this step to determine that, and they actually need to be able to define for you quite clearly, this is what makes the ideal picture before they can freeze the picture. And so I've stood behind you kind of go, I can freeze the picture, but what they're lacking is that they don't actually know what the fundamental is for that's good enough. They'll be sitting on it, but they don't recognize, oh, I've actually got the anatomy, because they can't define what the ideal picture is. So that's a step that you have to do. You have to be able to articulate, this is what ideal looks like. So if they're freezing and it's not ideal, it's not good enough to go, no, try again. You have to then go unfree. Oh, no, as the picture is frozen, what's the matter with this picture? Or these are the reasons why I don't like that. The depth is too deep, or the depth is too shallow, or your gain is too high. Have a look at this, then get the picture again, set it correctly, see the difference. So unless they can articulate what it is that defines that as a good picture, you know, they can't freeze and just suddenly get that by osmosis. Anyway, all right, well, we might call it a wrap there. I thank you so much for joining us tonight. We don't have a coaching corner in January. I'm going to the beach, yay! So we won't be having a coaching corner the first Thursday in January. I don't even know if that's New Year's Day, and you won't get me on New Year's Day. So our next coaching corner will be the first Thursday of February at 7:30 Melbourne time. I hope to see you all then. Thanks so much.